Chapter 9. The coffee shop was half empty. Waitresses perched on the back tables, gossiping. The cook stood in the doorway to the kitchen, trading barbs with the maitre d' who sat in the entrance to the bar. The entire place seemed to be winding itself down, or up perhaps, as it recovered from the late afternoon traffic and braced for the dinner trade that would be in an hour or so. Two men sat alone in a corner booth, as they had almost every Wednesday at this time for the last 9 years. They would sip their coffee, talk softly, then overtip and leave separately. Years ago, the men had been grist for wild speculations, but now, well, there were two old fags who were regulars and tipped well. "I'm growing anxious," the taller of the two said quietly. "It's been almost a month, and yet I still get nothing but words from you. I don't come here for words." The smaller man shrugged. "Do you think I enjoy this? I want to give you more, I do." He paused. "I just can't right now. Please try to understand." His voice was sad, almost begging for understanding. The tall man slowly nodded, then reached out, taking the smaller man's hands in his. He patted them gently. "I'm sorry," he said with the hint of a smile. "I'm just getting crotchety in my old age." "I shouldn't have snapped at you," the smaller man said. "Do you forgive me?" "Of course," he sounded sincere. "So, what can I tell our friends about the investigation?" Tabbert, the smaller man, handed an envelope under the table to the tall man. "These are the latest report summaries." The tall man pocketed the envelope without looking in it. "Seems awfully thin." Tabbert shrugged. "Their investigation is likewise thin." "Our friends are anxious for more than this," the tall man said in a disappointed tone. "Why?" Tabbert seemed genuinely confused. "Why is Moscow in such a state over one psychotic American agent at large in Germany?" "You know," the tall man said with a smile, "the last time I was in Moscow I went over to Yeltsin's house and asked him that very question." He adopted a self-important comedic tone. "Boris," I said, "why do you care anything about this crazy American?" Do you know what he said to me? "What?" Tabbert chuckled. Instantly, the tall man's face took on a serious, somehow dangerous expression. He said, "Stop asking stupid questions and get me some fucking answers." For a moment, his expression froze, a picture of rage and fury. Then it was gone, replaced by the gentle expression that had been there before. "What do you think of that, my good doctor?" Tabbert froze. When he finally spoke, his voice was seasoned with anxiety. "I have heard some small things. Tell me." "It seems," Tabbert began, then stopped as a young streetwalker came in and sat down 3 tables away. After she was served, he continued, but in a noticeably lower voice. "It seems that they are about to expand the search abroad and reduce it locally." "Why?" The tall man's gaze was demanding. "Directives from Washington and NATO command Brussels. They are dissatisfied with the results to date and are becoming convinced that Newman must have moved on." "And what is the opinion of the search commander?" Tabbert looked over at the streetwalker as she sipped her coffee. She noticed and smiled at him. "Shameless," he said softly, never taking his eyes off her. "Her skirt is so short you can almost see her." "I don't care what you can almost see," the tall man demanded as he noisily put his cup down. "She has nothing you would recognize anyway." He paused as a near-trembling Tabbert turned back to him. "You have no right to speak to me in such a fashion," he said in a distressed squeak. "No right. For 20 years more I have been faithful to you, to our cause." The tall man sighed deeply before beginning again. "Manfred, old friend," he said soothingly, "forgive me." He began stroking Tabbert's clenched hand. They slowly opened up like flower petals, rapidly wrapping themselves around the tall man's big hand. "Manfred, the times have changed and not for the better, I'm afraid." He seemed torn on the edge of a dilemma. Then, with a sharp nod of his head, he continued, "If I do not satisfy their needs, they will find someone else who will." He looked down at the table, lowering his voice as well, to what he hoped was an appropriate mixture of sadness and surrender. Perhaps that would be better. I am old. No. Tabert's voice was insistent. He reached out and raised the old man's head with his hand under the man's chin. You are not old. The tall man smiled bitterly. I have never before failed them in any task. He paused as he looked deeply into Tabert's eyes. Or raise my voice to you, my Madalena. Perhaps I failed you as well. Tabert smiled as he cried. He raised the tall man's hand to his lips and kissed it softly. No, Tabert said with deep feeling, you could not ever fail me. He patted the hand. There must be some other thing we can tell them. Like what? The tall man said in a sad, distant voice. Tabert was deep in thought as he continued to cling to the big man's hands. Personnel changes, perhaps? Personnel changes? The tall man sounded unconvinced. They identified the second man that Newman killed on the grounds. So? He was one of Beck's automatons. General Drek put him there as a contingency in case of Newman's escape. Go on, the tall man said quietly, still looking down mournfully. But his eyes were sharp, clear, and ablaze with triumph. Tabert leaned closer to the tall man. Since the abominable failures of General Drekbeck, they have discussed splitting command of the search between him and the unit commander of the covert search team. The tall man shrugged and, he said, sounding very unmoved. Again, Tabert reached out and lifted the tall man's face. Beck would still be the overall commander, but the unit commander would make all the operational decisions. He looked into the apparently non-understanding eyes. If they go through with it, then it effectively castrates Beck. Not that he doesn't deserve it, he added angrily. The tall man started to seem interested. But do we know anything about this other man? The man who would be taking over? Tabert smiled. I will personally put his personnel file into your hands, my passion. The tall man hesitated, then leaned forward and kissed Tabert on the cheek. The streetwalker stood up, shook her head as she noticed the two old men, then walked out of the coffee shop. Once clear of the shop's windows, she hurried down the street to the phone box. She opened her tiny purse, taking out a photocopy of a small pencil sketch. She nodded as she deposited the coins and dialed the number. Hello? She looked around to make sure she was alone. Ingrid Springer? The male voice on the other end hesitated before answering. Then, with sudden recognition, his voice came firmly through the receiver. Yeah, Ingrid? I have found the one you are seeking. On the outskirts of Munich, some 30 miles away, another search was about to be the subject of discussion. The converted barn had long tables lining the two sides. Each was covered with maps, loose papers, bound reports, all interspersed with telephones and radios. The far end was a stage of sorts with a huge movie screen, a large whiteboard, and a narrow table. But dominating the room high above the movie screen was a large blow-up of Brian Newman. He seemed to look down on the crowded barn, his expression somewhere between bemusement and sadness. The 32 people in the room finished arranging their chairs in the center, facing the stage just as the main player stepped onto it. Captain John Kilgore, the first man out, was young, no more than 30, who wore blue jeans, a tight turtleneck that didn't hide the fact that he was in perfect condition, and somewhat charming combat boots. He walked in and sat down facing the men. His eyes were clear, his posture perfect, his expression set. Next came back. He looked 20 years older than his 52 years. Deep black circles virtually surrounded his eyes. His skin was the color of day-old ground beef, and he had a tick under his left ear. Excuse me. His clothes looked slept in. He appeared not to have shaved in a week as he dropped heavily into his chair. The last man out was Dr. Kaff. Looking as indecipherable as usual, he took a seat next to Beck, immediately opening up the folder in front of him. He read it for a moment, then closed it, looking calmly out at the audience. Kilgore leaned over, whispered something to Beck, who nodded, then Kilgore stood up. "Good evening, people," he began in a strong, deep voice. "This is day 33 of probe 95-0707. As of 1600 today, the suspect is still at large, still considered possibly armed, and definitely dangerous." He turned a page in the folder in front of him. The reported sighting in Mansbrook was fully investigated by the 342nd Military Police Detachment out of Wiesbaden Air Base. The individual reported in the sighting was satisfactorily identified as a German national and was released with apologies after 6 hours of close detention. He signaled to back the room, and a photograph of the German came on the screen. Kilgore shook his head. "Now, this is exactly what we've been talking about, guys." His tone was casual. "There's a superficial resemblance, sure, but check out the eyes, the spacing between them, their relation to the bridge of the nose, their alignment at the edge of the mouth." He laughed. "This guy ain't even close." He nodded, and the projector was turned off. "Remember, concentrate on the things that are the hardest to change. Our probe is an experienced operative. He'll change his appearance as much as possible, but there's nothing he can easily do about the eyes. The nose, the mouth, burn them into your minds." He checked his notes and turned to Beck. "General, is there anything you care to add?" Beck just silently shook his head. "All right, then let's get to it." Kilgore looked around the room. "Ground staff?" A young man stood up in the first row. "We have men on the ground as far as Leipzig, as far west as Stuttgart. We're currently covering 21 cities within the triangle on a rotating basis, but to be absolutely honest, if any of our guys spot him, it'll be the purest of luck." He sat down with a sad expression on his face. "Air?" Another man stood up, this time in the back of the room. "We have every small air park covered round the clock. No aircraft have been reported missing since those 3 that we accounted for this morning. By the way, the local narco squad sent us an official thank you for identifying those drug runners." "Glad to see you're finding someone," Kilgore laughed. "Liaison?" An older man hung up a telephone and turned to face the stage. "We're still getting good cooperation from the German authorities, thanks to intervention from the German Interior Ministry. They're getting a little pissed off at us, but they're still circulating the photographs and keeping an eye out. But frankly, I don't think they're trying as hard as they were." "Are we?" Kilgore tried in. He turned to Kaff. "Psyops?" Kaff nodded. "Nothing new to add at this time, except my belief that Mr. Newman is still somewhere in the vicinity, possibly very close. Kilgore looked down at him as if he were about to ask a question. Thinking better of it, he turned back to the men. Immigration. A woman looked up from her phone. Hold on, she said quietly into it. All U.S. points of entry are on full alert status with likenesses, full descriptions, and computer-altered photographs of the probe showing him as he might appear in any number of disguises. So far, no bites. German border guards report nothing as well. She turned back to her phone. Strike Commander. Kilgore looked through the room. Strike Commander. A man came hurrying in. Sorry, John. Go ahead. We've still got 4 teams on full standby to move anywhere in the country within 3 hours. You find him, we'll take him down. He paused as he sat down. Just try and find us real targets next time. Kilgore nodded. How is the gentleman from Mansbrook? Threatening to sue all of us, both governments and anyone else he can think of. Kilgore smiled. Okay, everybody see your lawyers on your own time. They all laughed lightly. Kilgore let it go on for a moment before continuing. Let's grim up. He paused as he settled down. It's been 33 days, guys. 33 days. Guys. That's an interesting term. Anyway, he sounded legitimately angry. Granted, this guy is a pro, fully trained in SCRE, probably almost to an instinctive level, and he makes his living avoiding guys like us. But, come on. We make our living catching guys like him. Get off your asses and find this guy before I turn all of you in for a pack of elderly bloodhounds. Dismiss. They all quickly returned to work. Captain Beck followed Kilgore off the stage to his small private office. I am always surprised, Cap said as he settled into an easy chair, at your informality, Captain. Kilgore shrugged. They're under enough pressure just trying to do their jobs without me screaming about uniform buttons, haircuts, and proper military etiquette. He sat down on a small couch opposite Cap. We're wasting time, Beck said as he slowly shook his head. The younger officer looked over at him. Sir? I'm going out, he slurred as he turned and stared out of the room. We're not going to find him here. Kilgore stared at the spot Beck had stood on for a long time. Starting to worry about him, he said without looking away. Cap nodded solemnly. He is under more stress than I've ever observed in any individual, most of it self-inflicted, in my opinion. Kilgore turned to face the psychiatrist. Speaking of your opinions, Cap smiled. You still don't believe that Mr. Newman is close to hand? No. Why not? Because I wouldn't be. His tone was anything but that of Captain Friendly of a few moments before. I've had a lot of the same training as he's had. I know all the rules. Kilgore began to tick them off on his fingers. Don't run in a straight line. Don't stay in one place more than 6 hours. Don't travel during the day. Don't look anybody in the eye. Don't look away either. He moved forward onto the edge of the couch, but all the rules presuppose movement. And I assure you, Captain, that Mr. Newman knows them as well. Further, he knows that you know them. As you pointed out to your men, he is an expert in SCRE, survival, evasion, resistance, and escape. He has most likely improved it from an art to a science. He paused, deep in thought that continued. His rules may now be considerably different than yours. He will assume that you, as a creature of the military, as an issue of proper procedure and discipline, will do as you have done. Begin your search in the middle, always spiraling your way outward. He would consider the safest place to be within your perimeter, not fleeing from it. Witnesses remaining on the Institute's grounds until the search had moved on. He smiled briefly as if in admiration, then instantly banished the expression. Then he's trapped, Kilgore said softly. Cap smiled a sad, nearly defeated smile. Far from it. He merely finds a place where he can hide without any major difficulties and waits for your search to pass him by. He knows eventually he'll move on. Then he'll be free to go wherever he pleases. Kilgore raised his eyebrows. He's that calculating? And far more so, Cap said. Kilgore stood up and walked behind the desk. So what am I supposed to do? What are your orders? The young soldier picked up a piece of paper and handed it to Cap. Continue to expand the search. He recited, until we reach all 4 borders. Then disband the core operation, leaving to the intelligence to come up with the lead. As expected, Cap said as he read. As Newman would expect. So, what would you advise? Cap handed back the orders. Ignore that rubbish. Concentrate your efforts within the distance that Mr. Newman could have gotten by sunrise on the day that he escaped from the Institute. Kilgore checked a wall chart that held all the vital statistics of probe 95-0707. He killed the general's man sometime between 2 and 4. He checked some papers on the desk. Sunrise was at 0732. 3.5 to 5.5 hours, Cap said. There were no reports of any stolen vehicles? None. Now Kilgore was doing the math. Figure an average foot speed of 6 kilometers per hour. We're talking a maximum perimeter of 33 kilometers. That should be your search area, Captain. Cap stood to leave. He will most likely be within that tract. Kilgore appeared honestly torn between his orders and Cap's advice. After a long moment of silence, he sadly shook his head. Command's already talking about changing our assignment. They're convinced that he's already left the country. He paused, and they're worried about their budgets. This is costing a ton of bucks. Cap stopped at the door. So what will you do? What I know. I'll follow my orders and keep expanding the search, but... He said as Cap started to protest, I'll also increase local coverage by 25%. Cap nodded as he left. I'm overdue at the Institute. I'll walk you out, Doctor. The 2 men walked silently through the search headquarters, stopping at the far door. It's the best I can do, Doctor. Believe me, I know them. They won't accept any greater commitment of forces. It will not be enough, Captain. You're sure? Yes. How? Cap turned back to the earnest young officer, then pointed up at the huge photograph of Newman that seemed to be watching them, because I know him. At the Volker Institute, things had long ago returned to normal. Most of the staff, never having been aware of Newman's presence in the first place, simply went on, interrupted with their usual routine. Those that had been assigned to the unit had been briefed, sworn to secrecy, and returned to their jobs, with 2 exceptions. Jack Clemente lay in a top-floor VIP suite racked with pain, slowly being eaten away by the malignancy within him. He hadn't been out of bed since the day of Newman's escape, and Patricia, although apparently healthy and back at work, was sick at heart. Tormented by unanswerable questions, laden with guilt, she'd show up for work each morning, see her patient load for the day. Give her lecture, then retreat into her office, allegedly to work on a paper about her experience with Newman. Actually, to brood in despair. She'd gone over it so many times, analyzed every facet of it, viewed every minute of video available, read the transcripts. Yet still, a month after the fact, she couldn't find her mistake. Maybe, she was beginning to think, there was no mistake. As she watched the sun setting through her office window, she turned on her tape recorder and began to dictate. Notes on subsection 3. She paused as she watched a shadow move across the unit in the distance. She shut the recorder off and put it down as she allowed her mind to free associate. Immediately after the escape, things had been utter chaos. There had really been no time for postmortems or second-guessing. There had just been a flat-out dash to find and subdue the missing man. Guards had been everywhere, briefings for the special military people, the Department of Defense brass, debriefings for the people that had been there when he'd made his break, had tumbled one upon the other, and at no time, in no way, did anyone even mention the prospect of what might happen if they couldn't catch him. But that had been a month ago, and since then nothing had happened. Patricia began absently playing with the rubber band as her mind continued its slow-motion replay. After 2 weeks and no sign of Newman, the pace eased. Regular duties began to intrude themselves into everyone's schedule. The demands of the searchers on the staff lessened, and finally they were confronted with returning to normal. That's when Tabbert had called the meeting. Patricia had arrived at the chief's office with her resignation neatly typed up. She knew that her end at the Institute was now inevitable. Tabbert was going to need a scapegoat, and who better than the woman who, in his twisted little mind, was responsible? And how it is, a voice deep inside her reminded. She had expected this to be a pro forma meeting where Tabbert would ask for and she would tender her resignation. How, since she'd been the one that had argued against Newman being in restraints, Tabbert had more than enough ammunition to do her in. But it was more complicated than that, she told herself. Newman had some button pushed by the panel, something that triggered this unpredictable behavior. That was the only possible explanation for it. But, of course, Tabbert would find a way to twist all that around. She had expected it to be a short, ugly, depressing meeting. She was shown into Tabbert's office, receiving the first of what would be several surprises that day. Rather than its sterile emptiness, the room was packed with people. Jack Clementi, in a wheelchair and on oxygen, sat to the left of Tabbert, Otter Cap, and Pierre Mont lounged on the sofa, while General Beck sat at the bay window staring out across the lawn. Dr. Tabbert sat behind his large, shiny desk, sipping tea from a glass. He nodded formally at Patricia as she entered and sat down in front of him. Clementi looked terrible. The ravages of the cancer had been compounded by the stress of Newman's escape. She tried to make eye contact with him, smiled in his direction, but he just looked down, waiting for Tabbert to begin. Very well, the chief of staff finally said. I have been informed by the military that, other than an occasional consultation, they are done with us. Therefore, I believe it is time for us to assess for ourselves exactly what has happened, why, where responsibility lies, and what remedial actions need to be taken. He looked right at her during that last part. After long discussions with Dr. Clementi, I have reached the following preliminary conclusions. I would like all your opinions on them so that I might best formulate a report to the board of directors. Patricia braced herself for the worst. Tabbert began to read from a typed list. 1. From his arrival into our care until he was brought up to appear before the review board, the subject was always in the complete custody and control of the personnel at Unit A-2-249. He paused. Is there any dissent or discussion to that point? Clementi briefly removed his oxygen mask. Looking directly at Patricia, he spoke in a wheezy, weak voice. Not at all. He held her eye contact for a long time. Patricia got the message and nodded ever so slightly. Tabbert looked back down at his sheet. 2. Throughout his custody and care, no unanticipated difficulties of a behavioral nature were observed or reported that in any way threatened either unit personnel or the possible unplanned release of the subject. Another pause. Dissent or discussion? He was looking right at Mont. The man almost killed me, Mont muttered under his breath. Tabbert shook his head. The word in question here, Dr. Mont, is unanticipated. Your occurrence with the subject was well anticipated. You cornered him, metaphorically speaking, and he reacted in a completely anticipated, semi-hostile manner. Patricia was beginning to understand. His semi-hostile manner almost semi-killed me, metaphorically speaking, Mont said angrily. But it was not unanticipated, I think you'll agree, Tabbert said patiently. Of course not, Dr. Tabbert, Patricia ventured. The little man turned to her and smiled. Thank you, Dr. Nelwyn. He returned to his paper. 3. The DoD Review Board was advised that it would be unsafe for the subject to be removed from his quarters and brought up to meet with them. It was suggested by senior staff that they go down to meet with the subject or that he be brought up to them shackled and restrained. They rejected these recommendations fully. Dissent or discussion? It was to be a full-scale cover-up. Patricia began to smile. 4. Tabbert read on. In the face of the unwise demands of the DoD Review Board, all steps were taken to ensure the maximum safety and security of all involved. These included, but were not limited to, a full session between Dr. Nelwyn and the subject. Her advice was that the subject appear cooperative, but that she would remain alert to any warning signs of change. He looked at Patricia. Dissent or discussion? None at all, she said in a pleasant voice. Tabbert droned on for the next 20 minutes with the official version of the chain of events that led to Newman's eventual escape. The Institute was blameless. The Review Board had been unwise, reckless in their dealings with Newman. The Review Board shouldered full responsibility, the Institute full credit for keeping it from happening before. When he finished, he quickly went around the room. Captain Clementi immediately agreed with Tabbert's report. Beck nodded silently. Mont grunted his unwilling assent. Then Tabbert turned back to Patricia. Dr. Nelwyn, I will be blunt. We have not always seen eye to eye on this and other matters, but I propose we set our differences aside for the sake of the Institute. She fingered the letter of resignation in her pocket. For the sake of a long, prosperous future together? She asked, in a voice tinged slightly with nerves. Clementi flinched at the tone in her voice, but she never took her eyes off Tabbert, who stood stock-still for a full minute before nodding. Agreed, Tabbert said quietly. Agreed, she responded. Since then, she had returned to work, at least that work that Tabbert would allow her. They had reached an unspoken agreement in return for her support of Tabbert's cover-up. She would remain at the Institute, would probably be promoted to senior staff eventually, but Tabbert would see to it that she would never again receive important patients or assignments. For the moment, at least, it was tolerable. She could work on her paper about Newman. The Institute would support her research into the possibilities of human evolution, however grudgingly. And after a time, she would move on, probably to a think tank or a university back in the States. But despite this victory of attrition, Patricia knew that she would always consider herself a failure until and unless she finally put the question of Brian Newman to rest. She picked up the recorder and began again. If the basis of this paper is sound, if the subject is an example of man's inevitable evolutionary development, if the subject suspected this, then perhaps he feared that the panel would, out of fear or malevolence, seek to exterminate him. This action, from the perspective of the subject, would seem as the logical extension of their fear of what he might do, and what he might mean to their sense of genetic security. She stopped and played it back. As she listened, she pictured the outrage, the controversy that would explode when she published this paper. She would be instantly deified and demonized. But neither prospect gave her any personal satisfaction, not anymore. The only thing that mattered was Newman. The truths, the answer that lay within him, were the holy grail of everything Patricia believed in. She felt within her an unquenchable desire to know beyond any doubt or conjecture where mankind was going, who and what he was going to become in the millennia ahead, and Newman was the Rosetta Stone to unscrambling that puzzle, but he was gone. Sighing deeply, she decided to stop by Jack Clementi's room before leaving for the day. She felt a responsibility to be there for him now, as he had been for her. She hated sick rooms, always ended up depressed after them. But she owed Jack, even dying, being slowly consumed with it from within. He had forced Tabbert to keep her on staff to allow her another possible shot at Newman. She forced up a smile as she knocked on the door. His wife was sitting next to his bed, silently knitting, while the television murmured in the background. Clemente seemed to be sleeping, fitfully, but sleeping nonetheless. Jenny looked up as Patricia walked in. The old woman smiled. "How are you, darling?" Jenny's voice was a perky whisper. She warmly embraced Patricia. For a moment, Patricia wondered if Jenny truly realized just how sick her husband was. But of course she knew. After all her years of devotion to Jack, she wasn't going to let him down now by playing the grieving widow anywhere he could see it. Patricia kissed her on the cheek. "How are you?" Jenny shrugged. "Had a tough afternoon, but he's much better now, I think." She looked over at the only man she had ever loved. "I think he looks better, don't you?" Patricia didn't. "Absolutely," she said, trying to sound sincere. Already she was dying to leap for the door and run away, but her sense of duty overcame her anxiety. "I don't want to wake him." She took a half step toward the bed, then turned to Jenny. "Can I do anything for you?" "What about me?" Clemente said from the bed. Jenny smiled broadly, walked over and kissed him on the cheek. "Well," she said brightly, "look who's awake." "Dr. Nelwyn," Clemente said in a mock professional wheeze, "would you kindly order my wife to go home, get something to eat, some rest?" Patricia walked over and kissed him on the other cheek. "You see," Clemente said, smiling at his wife, "you worried how I look, and young, sexy women can't keep their lips off me. Go." Jenny nodded, picked up her purse, then kissed her husband again. "Just a little bite in the cafeteria, sweetheart." Patricia put her arm around her. "I'll stay until you get back." Jenny nodded, turned, and started for the door. She opened it, stopped, and turned back. "I love you," she said in a voice laden with tears. "Go," Clemente demanded. Jenny turned and hurried away before he could see the tears begin to run. Patricia pulled a chair alongside the bed. "So, old man, how are they treating you?" Her expression said nothing wrong, just two old friends passing the time of day. Clemente managed to shrug. "I'm dying." He said it simply, one of the more natural processes of life. He coughed, causing him to put the oxygen mask on for 2 minutes. Finally, he took it off. "I just wish it wouldn't take so damn long." Patricia didn't know what to say or do. Clemente, sensing it, just smiled. "So how are things in internal exile?" "Quiet." "I can imagine." He paused and took her hand. "How's the paper coming?" "You really want to know about this? I mean..." She looked around at all the apparatuses that labored to keep him alive. "Your bedside manners, as always, is impeccable." Patricia looked embarrassed. "We can talk about my carcinoma if you prefer," Clemente said casually. "I've had some rather nice Polaroids taken during last week's operation." Patricia laughed and held up her hands in surrender. "I'll pass." An awkward pause. "The paper, right? Well, it's coming. Slowly, but it's coming." "What's the problem?" "I keep running into walls." "Go on." She stood up and began to pace. "Kep's dichotomy," she said. "If Newman is mentally diseased, we can only know for sure with the passage of time. Simultaneously, if he's not sick, if he is the next evolutionary stage of man, we can only know for sure with the passage of time. And without Newman, or being able to conduct further tests and studies on a higher level than anything we ever run before, we can neither prove nor disprove either theory." Clemente was silent for a moment. "And how do you feel about that?" Patricia spun to face him. "Don't you try to analyze me, Jack Clemente. Bedridden or not, I'll pop you one." Clemente inclined his head to one side, thinking it over. "What's the matter? Clinical Patty? Just have a nerve hit?" "You're not dying," she said, as she sat down. "You're just using that as an excuse to be a pain in the ass." "True," he said in a weaker voice, "but you never answered my question. How do you feel about not having Newman around to prove your theory?" His voice might have been weak, but his eyes demanded an answer. "Truth?" Sure. She leaned close to him and whispered, relieved. She looked surprised. What's that supposed to mean? I was wondering if you'd ever admit you're worried you might be wrong. She shook her head. That's not it, she said as the door opened behind her. I'm scared to death that I might be right. She turned to see who had come in, but there was no one, only the door silently swinging closed. She shrugged and changed the subject to Institute gossip until Jenny returned an hour later. 5 floors below Clemente's room, the Institute's chapel sat off to one side of the main lobby. Always dimly lit, the non-denominational place for prayer and meditation was open around the clock throughout the week. But in truth, it was seldom used by anyone other than the occasional day visitor. Tonight, though, one man kneeled behind a front pew, hands clasped together, head bowed, leaning against them. Conrad Edel, as was his practice these last few weeks, had stopped to say a prayer on his way out of the building. We humble ourselves before you, O Lord, he mumbled. Yours is the greatness and the good. Yours is the power and the glory. Yours is the hope and the redemption and the inspiration. He squeezed his eyes tighter as he felt the Spirit well up within him. My God, as thou hast before, watch over your humble servant. My way is your way, in your steps I seek to stride. Grant me the wisdom and the strength to bear my burdens silently, the humility to place the needs of others above my own, the sure and certain faith in the perfection of your plan for us in your universe. The chapel door opened behind him, but he didn't let it disturb the sense of grace that he always felt as he neared the end of his prayers. My Lord, grant rest and comfort to Jack Clemente, who suffers the terrible pains of cancer. Grant peace to the mind of Alexander Beck, who stands on the precipice of the most terrible place you put within us all. And, my Lord God, bestow upon your lost lamb, Ryan Newman, your gentle kindness and tender mercies. Bring down upon him the calm serenity and peace that he so desperately seeks. Grant to him the self-control and the wisdom to do the right thing in this, his moment of greatest trial. In the name of your Son, I do beseech you, amen. Edel paused, then pulled himself to his feet. As he turned, starting back up the aisle, he noticed a man kneeling deep in prayer in one of the shadowy corners of the chapel. He looked away, not wishing to intrude. Amen, Newman said as he raised his head to look at the door as it slowly swung shut behind the security chief.